For over 20 years, Universal has been trying to build its own cinematic universe of classic monsters. The Invisible Man, the Wolfman, the Mummy, Frankenstein. All the big names, and somehow every single attempt has failed in one way or another. And look, it makes sense. Every major Hollywood studio wants its own money-printing universe. You can't really blame Universal for chasing that. The funny part is that only one studio actually pulled it off cleanly, and it wasn't even the first one to try. Warner Brothers, for example, was already messing with this idea back in the 90s. But Warner has this very specific problem. They want everything at once. And when everything doesn't work immediately, panic kicks in, projects get canceled, delayed, rewritten, reshuffled, and suddenly you don't have one universe anymore. You've got multiple half-broken ones. Some movies don't even make it into any universe at all, and eventually everything gets rebooted again, usually with some guy who runs really fast. Yeah, The Flash. They even had a similar situation with their own monster universe, and at one point, literally fought Universal over the name Monster Universe. But at least Warner keeps trying to move forward. Universal? Universal sees one problem and immediately goes, nope, reset. And the weird thing is, not all of these movies were even that bad. If you look at Marvel, they survived the Incredible Hulk, Captain America making just okay money, and still turned the whole thing into a billion-dollar machine. So yeah, even after a stumble, you can absolutely recover. Sometimes the chances are actually pretty good. Universal just doesn't believe in that. If something doesn't work, their solution is simple. Start over, again and again and again. So today we're going to go through all those fresh starts from Universal, a studio that clearly wants its own universe, but is kind of terrified to take the second step. Now, technically, Universal wanted to build this monster universe way back in the 1980s, but every time they got close to production, someone upstairs would suddenly decide the risk was too high, the script wasn't good enough, and the whole thing would get thrown onto a shelf, over and over again. Nothing ever actually moved forward. That is until Stephen Sommers showed up. And Sommers didn't just bring an idea, he brought The Mummy. And that one? That one worked. The movie was a box office hit. The studio loved it, and suddenly, Sommers was their guy. When it came time for the sequel, they basically gave him full creative freedom. The Mummy Returns also did great, then he produced The Scorpion King, and at that point, Universal's president was calling him the studio's biggest asset, and casually comparing him to Steven Spielberg. So yeah, Sommers had leverage. A lot of it. Which is exactly how he convinced them to let him make a movie packed with multiple classic monsters, basically setting up a universe where those characters could spin off into their own films later, just like The Scorpion King did. The only issue? Money. Of course. The studio was ready to spend big, but they kept pushing Sommers to stay somewhere in the 80 to 100 million range. And Sommers was like, that's not happening. He straight up said making Van Helsing for 80 million didn't make sense, and the movie just wouldn't work at that scale. At the time, the studio still trusted him enough to go higher. They gave him 140 million. But then the shoot dragged on, the schedule slipped, and suddenly that budget wasn't enough anymore. Test screenings didn't help either. More fixes, more work, more money. By the end of it, the budget had climbed to 160 million. And in 2004, that was huge. For comparison, The Mummy cost 80 million, and the sequel was 100. This thing was on another level. And here's where it gets wild. The studio still believed in it. So much so that they greenlit a sequel to Van Helsing before the movie even came out. In the Czech Republic, they didn't even take down the sets. They just kept paying for them, month after month, ready to roll straight into the sequel as soon as the first box office numbers came in. Sommers already had a script, the studio liked it, everything was ready. All they needed was the movie to hit. Then they spent another 80 million on marketing. So now you're looking at roughly 250 million total invested in this thing. Big budget, big expectations, huge push, and then, yeah, it all collapsed in the second week of release. The box office came in way below what the studio expected. Audiences were lukewarm. Critics, they absolutely tore it apart. And once it became clear that the movie would barely cross 100 million domestically, that was it. The sequel? Gone. The werewolf spin-off? Gone. Everything got shut down almost immediately. Worldwide, the movie made about $300 million, which on paper is not terrible for a new IP. If the budget had stayed closer to what the studio originally wanted, this could have actually been considered a decent success. Not mummy-level success, but still solid. But with a $160 million production budget, it wasn't enough to break even. And once you factor in marketing, it gets even worse. According to Deadline, Universal lost somewhere between 80 and 100 million on Van Helsing. After that, Summers was out. He stayed on as a producer for The Mummy 3, but his directing run at Universal was basically over. A few years later, he made G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra for Paramount, which also didn't meet expectations, and that was pretty much it for his directing career. Now, realistically, Universal could have still taken a chance on a sequel. The movie probably made its money back on home video over time. There was still a path forward. But this is Universal we're talking about, and risk? Risk is not really their thing. So instead of pushing forward, they hit reset. And just like that, the whole dark universe idea went quiet for a while. 6 years later, Universal comes back to the idea. Because, of course they do. This time, The Wolfman is supposed to kick off the whole universe. And they're not playing small either. $150 million budget, huge swing. To direct it, they bring in Joe Johnston, the guy behind Jumanji and Jurassic Park 3. Now, Johnston is kind of a fascinating case because his career basically runs on a pattern. Hit, flop, hit, flop. Honey, I Shrunk the Kids. Big success. The Rocketeer didn't work. Jumanji, huge hit. October Sky underperformed. Jurassic Park 3, solid. Then Hidalgo? Yeah, that one crashed. And The Wolfman comes right after Hidalgo. So maybe Universal looked at that pattern and thought, alright, statistically, this one should be a hit. The only problem is, pattern didn't work this time. Not even close. And to be fair, the movie was already a mess before Johnston even showed up. The pre-production was a disaster. Directors kept coming and going, like a lot of them. Creative disagreements everywhere. Every time a new director pushed back, the studio basically showed them the door. Johnston, on the other hand, was willing to go along with whatever the studio wanted, so they went with him. Because at that point, they just needed someone who wouldn't argue. The result? One of the biggest flops of 2010. And unlike Van Helsing, where at least people showed up and then didn't love it, The Wolfman had a different problem. Nobody cared in the first place. There was just no audience interest. The movie felt like something no one was asking for, and this is on a $150 million budget for an R-rated movie, which is kind of insane when you think about it. In the end, it made around $100 million worldwide. That's it. So now Universal is looking at another failure, and at this point, they finally go, okay, maybe we need a different approach, which sounds promising. Except, it's Universal. In 2014, they tried again, this time with Dracula Untold. And suddenly, the budget is way smaller, around $70 million. Much more controlled, much safer. And guess what? It actually worked. Technically, the movie made about $217 million worldwide, which is enough to break even. So for the first time, their launch movie doesn't lose money. And just like Van Helsing, the film clearly sets up a sequel. It's right there. They're ready to continue. But Universal looks at this and goes, yeah, not good enough. Because in their mind, a just okay success isn't a strong enough foundation for a cinematic universe. Which is kind of ironic, considering how Marvel started. But again, Universal plays by its own rules. So what do? They hit reset. Again. And move the launch to the next movie, which is The Mummy. Now, originally The Mummy was supposed to come first, with Dracula following after. But while Dracula moved through development pretty smoothly, The Mummy got stuck in full-on development hell. Directors kept dropping out. Len Wiseman was attached at one point, the guy behind Underworld and the Total Recall remake, but he left because of budget disagreements. Then Andres Muschietti came in, known at the time for the horror movie Mama, but he also clashed with the producers and eventually left to go make it instead. So yeah, same story all over again. Universal finally circles back to The Mummy in 2015, and this is where things take a turn, because Tom Cruise gets involved, and suddenly all those we don't compromise rules are gone. Completely gone. Cruise gets full creative control over the movie. At this point, Universal is feeling confident. Big star, big franchise potential, they officially announced the Dark Universe. Full lineup. Actors attached. Plans for multiple films. This is it. This is the one that's finally going to work. And then the movie comes out, and yeah, same result. The Mummy makes about $410 million worldwide on a $125 million budget, which sounds good. It sounds like a success. But once you factor in the marketing, because the marketing budget was basically the same as production, the movie needed at least $500 million just to break even. And it didn't get there. On top of that, the domestic box office was weak. Audiences didn't love it, and overall reception was pretty rough across the board. So once again, the universe gets shut down. Fresh start number? I don't even know at this point. Of course, people needed someone to blame, and a lot of that blame went straight to Tom Cruise. The story goes that before he got involved, the script was much stronger, like emotional, dramatic, almost prestige level stuff. And then Cruise came in, changed everything, and turned it into, well, what we got. But the studio officially denies all of that and defends him, so there's no way to say it with 100% certainty. What we do know is that Cruise personally reworked the action scenes and designed many of them himself. And honestly, outside of the airplane sequence, it's hard to remember much else from that movie. Now, if the movie had strong reviews, Universal probably would have pushed forward anyway. Studios do that all the time. But with mediocre reception and no real breakout success, they just stopped. Again. A few years later, they announced yet another version of The Mummy, this time bringing back Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz, completely ignoring both the third movie and the Tom Cruise version, which honestly at this point feels very on brand. Whether this new movie will finally launch the universe or end up like Terminator, which has already been rebooted 3 times after its third film, each time somehow worse than the last, is anyone's guess. But knowing Universal, one thing is pretty clear. They're not giving up on this idea. Not now, not ever. And who knows, maybe in 20 years I'll be making a second video about this exact same story. But only if this one performs well on YouTube. Otherwise, yeah, I'll just reboot it, just like Universal. That was Frameback. Subscribe for more rewinds and see you on the next one.